Hello, my name is Casper Ramadi, and today I'll be talking about prions and how they represent a dangerous idea in the field of biology. Now, prions were first reportedly seen in Great Britain in the 1700s. This was caused by the sighting of sheep actually losing fur, having skin discoloration, and as well as having neurological damage. They wouldn't look up right away, they wouldn't respond to sensitive information, and essentially, this led to the first case being called scrappy, which is now being used as a term for all prion diseases caused in sheep. Now, bringing it into a humanistic world, in the 1970s, it was seen in the population of Papua New Guinea in a tribe, and it was named Kuru. Now, this disease was caused by prions, but its subset was very different in its infection than it was seen in Scrappy. The Papua New Guinea culture has this tradition of eating the remnants of brains from loved ones. Now, this can include people with or without prions. It's impossible to tell. And essentially, this led to the increase of prion diseases in Papua New Guinea, and this causing the first actual recognition of human prion diseases in the world. Now, giving some background information as to what a prion is. A prion is literally described as an infectious agent in the form of a misfolded protein. Now, your body creates amazing amounts of protein, and essentially these are misfolded proteins that have no genetic material, smaller than viruses, and do not have a metabolic rate at all. Now, they are responsible for neurodegenerative spongiform diseases, and what this is that it's contracted diseases. Some of it is hereditary, but it's usually contracted and it creates a spongy-like form of brain matter out of regular brain matter. So all prion diseases are neurodegenerative and completely lethal. There is no cure. If you have a prion disease, you will actually die at a certain time and point in life. There is no cure for this. All prion diseases have an incubation time that can range from weeks to years depending on the spread of the rate of the prions. Now, this can be very important in using it as a chemical warfare weapon against a certain population, as we will discuss further on. Now, let's look at some of the ways it can affect the brain. When prions actually come into the body, they can affect the brain matter, but also the constitution of its structure as well. As you can see, the brain on the left is very normal, at least to people familiar with these types of scans. It has a very definite shape to it and it's filled in. Whereas the brain on the right, it has spaces in the middle. You can actually see very more clearly the lines in between the brain matter and the ventricles, which is the space in between the two sides of the brain, are actually further spread apart. And this is caused by prions. As it enters a healthy organism, it travels to the brain where it can interact with other proteins and actually misfold those proteins as well, since prions are misfolded proteins. Now, the special thing about prions is that they can actually be in a plant and still infect a human if that protein is still found in humans, which there are cases that it is, as well as being found in an animal and infecting humans, such as seen in the mad cow disease that we will discuss further on. Now, there are three different ways that prions can be acquired by an animal. It's either sporadic, inherited, or acquired. Acquired is when it's through ingestion and when another animal eats a plant or another animal that contains prions. Now, it can occur in sporadic form as well, whereas a certain mutation led to the production of a prion that is now affecting other proteins in your body. Yet inherited is actually 10% of the actual infected population, and it's when genetic function is low to the point where prions are being produced by cells intentionally. Um, and prions are actually being made in such a manner that they can be infected through manure, they can infect reservoirs, they can be transmitted through plants, as well as they can be airborne particles and travel large distances as well. Now, this is crucial for what we were talking about as a dangerous idea because it leads into the role of chemical warfare among the uses of prions. Now, why is it that we just don't have a vaccine for prions or that we don't have an antibacterial for prions? Well, it's because prions aren't a bacteria and they aren't noticed by the cell. The cell thinks that it's a regular protein. Now, why isn't it that if we cook meat, the prions would degenerate, such as egg whites when you cook eggs? Well, the principle behind that is that when the protein misfolds, in this case becomes a prion, then you have a lot of beta pleated sheets that stack on top of one another to make the protein even stronger than it was before. So it's very hard to get rid of prions. Autoclaving does not work, and only certain agents like bleach or strong acidic detergents can actually be used in destroying prions. Now, a famous example of how a prion disease affected millions of people across the world was through the mad cow disease. Now, the mad cow disease was originally seen in England and it affected the meat of the cows. And it was because of a program called MBM, which stood for meat and bone meal, that was being fed to these cows. Now, if one cow was infected with prions and it was turned into meat and bone meal for the other cows, essentially the prion would spread from one animal to the next, and having an epidemic on your side of infected prions and infected animals, which essentially leads to infected human beings. Now, England saw an increase of 146 people infected in their country and 3 in the US as well. And there was actually a ban on English meat, specifically cattle, being imported from the US, from England to the US. Now, a specific disease that is caused by prions and affects humans mainly is the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or pronounced CJD if you want a short abbreviation of it. Now, this causes dementia, personality changes, hallucination, speech impairment, jerky movements, balance, and changes in posture as well as seizures. This affects people who have a certain form of prions affecting their neurological system and can be very detrimental. And as we talked about earlier, symptoms can be seen in weeks, essentially, of receiving prions. So it can have a very short turnaround rate in the human body. And as the final slide of this presentation, I wanted to share the idea of using prions as a biological weapon in warfare or against crumbling countries as well. This could go into effect by simply contaminating a large import they have of meats or foods or vegetation or contamination of a water source. Like I said, prions are very hard to get rid of, and it is essentially impossible to cure someone who has prions in their system. And this can lead to the degeneration of a society. It can affect underprivileged demographics easier and higher occurrence rates as well, and essentially become very powerful to those who control it, essentially leading up to a step higher in the chemical warfare department. I wanted to introduce this idea because I think that prions are actually the worst disease one can get, and essentially it attacks the very foundation of a society if it were to actually infect a certain population or a certain demographic.